So our panelists are we'll have Mark Bourgeois, who is a PhD candidate in philosophy and a former engineer. I questioned him about being former engineer. I think maybe once you're an engineer, you're always an engineer. He currently teaches engineering design as well as engineering ethics to Northwestern undergraduates. He's developed and taught a course in human subjects research for summer research students and created and teaches a unique course in ethics and regulation and public policy for the professional master's program.
Okay. All right. So thank you. I wanted to talk a little bit about, just briefly, about teaching ethics strategically to technical students, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So as she explained, most of the teaching that I do is to technical students. I haven't had the privilege of teaching a pure philosophy class yet. It's always been applied. Engineering undergrads, professional masters in drug and device industry, biomedical research undergrads. Those are the typical kinds of students I have and the kinds of courses I teach. So the question I want to explore a little bit is just what I'm trying to accomplish in these sorts of relatively limited, relatively brief ethics exposures to students who are not primarily dedicated themselves to studying ethics. So I'll start by saying, like she said, I come from an engineering background. And in design, what we're really taught is to define the problem first. Even before you start imagining, brainstorming your solutions, the most important thing is to understand what the needs are, understand what the problem is that you're trying to solve, and really make sure that you're clear on that. Make sure you're defining it precisely so that you can go about crafting solutions. And so I'm going to say, for our purposes now, that means know where you're trying to get to. But I've also worked with a lot of education researchers over the years, and one of the things that they stress is being learner-centric. What they mean by that is focusing on understanding where the students are actually coming from, including what sort of misconceptions they might have, or what they might be vulnerable to misunderstanding. So what that means in our context is to know where your students are starting from in terms of ethics. And I'm going to claim that the end, where you want to get to with these students, really depends inextricably on where they are starting from. And I think this is true, you could argue that it's true generally, but I'm going to argue that it's true to a much greater degree in ethics than it is in other subjects. And I think that this is because in ethics, very often what you're trying to do is get students to understand what the problem is in the first place. You're not focused on teaching them solutions to problems that they can see, as they are in most every other course they take. When they take a technical course, they sort of understand what the problems are that they're learning the strategies and the solutions for. In ethics, you're starting at least a step back. First, you have to get them to understand what the problems are. And that can be challenging to do. But it helps to know where they're starting from, and that they're starting from a perspective where they might not understand what the ethical problems are in their area, why these problems can be complex, or that there are even problems of an ethical nature at all in their profession. So I think this requires a more strategic approach, a more deliberate approach, and I'll give 3 examples based on the 3 populations I mentioned. Engineering undergrads. I assume that, and I've generally been proven correct in this over the years, as inexperienced aspiring engineers, they may not see the particular relevance of ethics to engineering, especially as freshmen. They tend to see engineering as being nearly 100% about being technically competent. So in my first exposure to them of engineering ethics, I actually try to avoid talking about obvious ethical issues. What we do instead is study a design. We step through the different aspects of a hybrid car, a Toyota Prius, and we try to understand the social and environmental impact of the major design choices that are contained within it. And I think that they begin to see that normal engineering decisions, for example, what kind of power train you put in a vehicle, may already be ethical decisions insofar as they entail important social consequences, positive and negative. And that it doesn't necessarily take an extreme case, the scale of the Citicorp Tower or the Challenger disaster, for engineering practice to raise ethical issues. It's ingrained in the subject. And I hope if they see that, then we can go on and talk more directly about actually making good decisions and good ethical decisions. At least that's where the next step would be. So my professional master's students, the ones in drug and device industries, I assume that they have contact with regulations and regulators and compliance offices. And I assume that they see these as either an important good or maybe just a necessary evil. But in either case, I think and I assume that they see these regulations as intended really to prevent harm coming to people. And it's true that that's one purpose that they have, but it's not the only one. So the first case that we talk about is a pretty innocuous seeming one. It's just about the labeling of milk that comes from cows that have been given genetically engineered hormones, RBST. And as we step through the case in the class, what they come to see is that if all the science shows that the milk is safe to drink and there's no human health hazards that we've turned up, and yet they still have an instinct that it would be good if people could know that this is what they're drinking, that we label the milk, or at least we label the milk that doesn't come from RBST cows. If you're going to take that position, then there have to be values other than safety at work in those rules. And really what they have to confront is what justifies having these regulations in the first place, or any regulations. It can't be just about preventing material health harms. And this really widens the scope of our concerns, and we come back to that fundamental question again and again throughout the class. For biomedical undergrads, especially the underclassmen, I assume that they view research as an unalloyed good. And, it's just intended to benefit the patients, benefit the subjects, the sort of naive sort of intuition we've been talking about most of today. So for them, we start by carefully pulling apart research and practice. And we talk about, so many of the issues we talked about in our symposium today. But we start early in the past of medical research. We talk about how initially practice and research were joined in sort of an ad hoc manner. A physician would try a new treatment on a new patient, see how it went, maybe try it again later. But, as the medical science progressed, research diverges more and more from practice for all the reasons we talked about, protocol, randomization, placebo control, things like that. And I hope that by the end, they see that research is very different than practice, and that you can't conduct both at once, and that the research subjects are not going to be the direct beneficiaries of the research, and that they may even be undertaking a risk. And of course, once they realize all of those things, which we all do already, then they should be more receptive to having a more formal RCR training in the future, more compliance focused. So in conclusion, to me, teaching ethics strategically means trying to understand where the students are starting from, and realizing that they may not see the point of even talking about ethics, having a course on ethics to begin with. And knowing, secondly, where it's important for them to get to, where at least they can start to see the outlines of the major issues in their fields and begin to appreciate why ethics is relevant, why it matters, and how much there is to learn about it. Of course, the challenge as an instructor is to develop a path which effectively connects where they're starting from and where you want them to get to. And that's easier said than done.
Oh, thank you, Mark.
Who's next?
Next, we're going to hear from Debjani, who we've met already, and who's already given us some idea of her philosophies here. I don't know, did Deb Jetty is a licensed clinical psychologist. She's director of the Donnelly Ethics Program and Rehabilitation Institute at Chicago and assistant professor in physical medicine and rehabilitation and medical humanities and bioethics at Northwestern, and interested in clinical ethics.
Thanks. Thanks, everybody. Hold on, I have to figure out, sorry. Stop, reset, start. Okay. I'm going to talk a little bit today about emotion and angst in ethics education, and I need to go to the slideshow. It has been a very long day. I'm very pleased with the day, but hopefully I'll be coherent for 8 minutes. So as Rosa mentioned, I'm the director of the ethics program at RIC, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the clinical ethics issues that we see and how we've thought about it in terms of education. And obviously for clinicians, the use of cases is a very natural way to think about. That's how they've been trained, and that's how they naturally think about, I just said that, how they are trained to approach other kinds of clinical dilemmas. And so using cases to think about ethical dilemmas is very akin to what they are already used to doing. So one thing we've prepared at RIC is a case analysis worksheet, which is adapted from numerous models. So if we have a tough case that comes in, we may end up going to a floor and doing a clinical ethics consultation, which I'll talk about in a minute. And that's something that's very much about people who have expertise and who have training and who try to solve problems on the floor. But we also have an educational component for all of the staff members, because we do believe that all of the staff members have their own ethical expertise, and to help them think through. So we have this case analysis worksheet. The very first question is, what is the ethics question? What's causing moral distress or discomfort? How many of you in the room have heard of the term moral distress? So quite a few of you. So that's the discomfort that comes from believing that there are institutional or other situations that do not allow you to behave in a way that you think is correct. And that can be something that's very distressing. Then we ask, what are the particulars of the case? Not only the medical, but also the social, the spiritual, the cultural. What are the religious practices? What are the person's social support? What's the occupation? And then we ask, who are the stakeholders and what is the nature of their interests? And it's not only the patient and the family and the healthcare team, but it might be the facility, it might be payers, it might be community members. We work a lot in the disability community, and sometimes there are disability ethics issues that have to do with broader societal topics, and are those things that have to get considered. And then have you considered the ethical issues? So respect for patient autonomy, self-determination, beneficence, justice. We try to frame them in ways that really match the case. And so I think one of the struggles when you're thinking about doing ethics education is using language and using concepts that people don't feel so rarefied or don't feel so abstract that they lack relevance with the people that you're interacting with at the bedside, or when you're working with clinicians especially, or with anybody actually. Respect for patient autonomy, we might look at whether the person has decision-making capacity, or if they lack capacity, has a surrogate been identified. Then we'll name the dilemma. Identify the values that are in conflict. Where are you getting your facts? Who is telling the story? I think part of our process is to think about the story that's being told and who's telling it, and how that might frame, when you were talking about going to the floors, you know, talking to different people at different points in time, you might hear versions of what's going on. Is this a legal problem? Does it violate a code of ethics? We actually have this worksheet that has all these questions on it, and I hand it out, and sometimes it helps to go through it in that way. It's kind of a tool we've developed. Sometimes it works really well, and frankly, sometimes it doesn't work that well. It really depends on the case. One thing I think we also were thinking about talking about is what doesn't work, because I think we all hope to be good teachers. We all hope that the topic that we're interested in or the concepts are clear and being expressed, but sometimes things fall flat. And so this is one tool we've developed. It kind of works most of the time, but it's not all the time. Implementation and follow-up. What went right? What went wrong? What would you do differently in the future? I also think considering the alternatives is very important. Sometimes people get stuck in there's either the right or the wrong, and sometimes there are many rights, and sometimes there are only a few wrongs or many wrongs, and thinking about all the different alternatives. So another thing I wanted to just take, and oh good, I'm right about in my halfway point, is thinking about the role of emotion in ethics. I think I'm somebody who's trained as a clinical psychologist, so in a way, emotion is something that is very natural from my training. After I finished my PhD, I did 2 years of postdoc in clinical medical ethics, and I was handed a pager and went and did ethics consultations at the University of Chicago. Then we'd come back and have case conferences, and that's when I first became involved in bioethics and in clinical medical ethics. And I think we often either minimize or avoid speaking about or don't pay attention to the emotion that is going on around these cases. And I'll tell you a little bit more about one thing we've started. We have a 3-part model for cases that are really, really tough, where we'll go in and do the ethics consultation, then we'll go back and do a debriefing and allow the staff to talk about their emotional reactions. And it's very much focused on what the staff's reaction is. Some of you in the room have actually been in these debriefings. And then we'll go back at a later point and actually do the education after people have kind of processed what it is about that case. And sometimes the educational seminar may be unrelated to the original ethics issue. So in this example that I wrote about in the Hastings Center, a case consultation was about decisional capacity. We did a case consultation using Dr. Applebaum's model for thinking about decisional capacity, but people were really upset with the daughter in this case, who they had was obstructing things. We went back into the debriefing. The educational seminar was not about capacity, which was what we would have planned as an ethics program. It was actually about personality disorders. They wanted to hear about something completely related, but that was the knowledge gap they had. So I think some creativity with where the educational gaps are also goes a long way. And finally, I wanted to just put up this as I talk about emotion, because I think this graphic really depicts very well. Now, as a psychologist, I actually am not Plutchik is not, he's more of a psychoevolutionary emotion researcher, which is not my own theoretical orientation to thinking about emotion. I'm much more of a cognitive behavioral and somebody who thinks about the ways that people perceive and the sociocultural aspects of emotion. But I think this wheel does a really nice job. If you look around, we often think of anger, disgust, sadness, surprise, fear, trust, and joy as basic emotions. But if you look at the way that they've, depicted this, it's also in intensity. So you can go and somebody can feel anger. Someone can also feel rage or just mere annoyance. And I think we need to also have a better language, a very specific language for thinking about some of these emotions. I'm not saying there's a place for it in every single ethics discussion. I think sometimes in the clinical realm, it's something that we need to at least grapple with or acknowledge. And the debriefing is one way to handle it. I'm not sure that's the only way or the best way, and I welcome some suggestions, but I think part of some of the dilemmas that people feel really come from things like anger or disgust or sadness. And just talking about it in terms of respect for autonomy or beneficence or justice separates it in a way that doesn't always address what's also going on there on another level. So that's my main point, and I'm at 8 minutes and 15 seconds, so I will stop. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And our next speaker is David Schnee, who is formally trained as a biomedical engineer and neuroscientist. He says he's not an ethicist, even though I said he was an ethicist. And before joining Northwestern, David conducted research at Smith-Ketterwell Eye Institute in San Francisco, and then was a member of the bioengineering faculty at the University of Illinois in Chicago. He's, as he said, he's assistant director of the interdepartmental neuroscience PhD program here.
All right. I was trying to find where I am emotionally on that wheel. Boredom? No, not boredom. Definitely. So I want to talk about a slightly different aspect of ethics. As Rosalind said, I don't consider myself an ethicist, and I'll stick to that. I'm hopefully more of an ethicist after sitting through today. But one of the things that I am involved with at Northwestern is responsible conduct of research. And as many of you know, this has become a fairly big deal, at least in the eyes of NIH and to a lesser extent NSF these days. And so I want to just talk a little bit about some of the practical issues of RCR on this campus, tell you a little bit about what I'm involved in, a little bit about what others do, and basically lay it out there. I'm interested in some ideas about how we can improve what we do here. I'm quite convinced that there are people at other places that do it better than we do, and so I'm not going to take a long time. I shouldn't get anywhere close to 8 minutes. So NIH definition of responsible conduct of research, it's defined as a practice of scientific investigation with integrity. It involves the awareness and application of established professional norms and ethical principles in the performance and all activities related to scientific research. So basically professional ethics for scientists. As sort of a newcomer to all of this, I think a lot about whether we're doing ethics or bioethics, how that differs from RCR, and so kind of for my own clarity, I thought I should have a Venn diagram in here. So if I compare RCR with bioethics, there's quite a lot of overlap, I think, more overlap than I could make work on this PowerPoint slide, and also I don't think that there are these, I don't have a laser pointer, I guess I do. Not that it's so critical. So these sharp boundaries here probably don't exist, but I couldn't figure out a way to blend those two. So there are a lot of topics that are common between RCR and bioethics. There are also some topics, I think, that fall outside the range of bioethics, arguably just pure concepts dealing with mentoring and lab safety, data acquisition, things like that. And then there are also topics that I think are very clinically oriented that probably are a little bit out of bounds for RCR. So NIH came up with this mandate for RCR training. First policy appeared back in 1989, and really that's been evolving for the past 20-some years, updated every once in a while. As many of you know, there's some pretty strict new guidelines that came out at the end of 2009 to be applied in 2010. And essentially, these mandates require pretty specific RCR training for what I'll refer to as trainees. And by that, I mean very specifically folks that are funded by certain NIH grants, principally those in the T, F, and K series, as well as the R25. At Northwestern, we have over 30 T32 grants. You heard from Jules DeWald earlier on. He happens to be the PI of 2 of those, and that's one of the reasons why we can hold this symposium today. We have a lot of students in our programs who receive these F awards, more commonly referred to as NRSAs, so they all have to receive this training. We have many junior faculty who have these K awards now, and they also are required to have this training, as well as people funded by the R25. So the NIH recommends these required RCR topics. We often joke at the fact that the NIH lists these topics. They say that they're not required, they're recommended, but some of you may know that it's not uncommon for grants to get kicked back if you don't have all the topics covered in your grant proposal. And so all of us now who teach RCR are obligated to cover all of these topics, and we do. We describe the program for doing so in our proposals. Many of them are related to topics that were discussed today. Some are not. I'm not going to talk about these in detail. There are other guidelines and requirements associated with the NIH mandate, and these turn out to be pretty critical and a topic of much discussion at the institutional level. So first of all, RCR training must be face-to-face. NIH is pretty clear about that. As all of you probably know, there are online training modules that also are available. NIH has made pretty clear that training must be face-to-face, must be greater than 8 hours. In addition to the trainees receiving this RCR training, NIH mandates that the trainers also receive this training. So what does this mean? Well, all of the trainees, or I should say most of the trainees, so certainly graduate students, undergraduates, postdocs, they all are in laboratories and very closely mentored and advised. And NIH wants those advisors to also be involved in the RCR training. This makes sense. And we talked last night a little bit about this notion of weaving RCR into really the research enterprise at the university. I think I would say that it's fair to say that that's probably the ultimate goal of NIH, not to have RCR as something separate and just an exercise that people complete, but really weave it into the fabric of the research enterprise so that people deal with RCR on an everyday basis. And so NIH has codified this by demanding that the trainers be involved. In practice, it turns out to be kind of hard to do. We can't involve all of our trainers in teaching classes in an easy way. Many of them are very resistant to that, and so interested in ideas about how that might be improved. Another issue is that NIH mandates that RCR training be provided at each stage of professional development, so at the undergrad level, post-fac level, if relevant, pre-doc, postdoc, and faculty level. That seems reasonable. They also indicate that training should happen every 4 years. Turns out that there's some logistical complications with that because most graduate students these days take about 6 years to get through a program, certainly in our neuroscience program. And so all of a sudden we're talking about potentially offering 2 sets of training for graduate students who are here for a long time. And so we are in the process of figuring out if that's the best way to do that. I've talked about NIH guidelines. NSF is also evolving its own guidelines, but in general they're kind of lagging behind NIH. So in terms of RCR training at Northwestern, for a long time now, the life science PhD programs have delivered non-credit courses to their graduate students. In fact, it's a requirement in all of Northwestern's life science PhD programs. And most students take this in either their 2nd or 3rd year. And so hence the time problem. If you take the course in your 2nd year, you need to have some refreshing in your 6th year. BME, my understanding is that they have not had any formal requirement until quite recently. And in fact, I was invited to provide the RCR training to the BME graduate students and postdocs. And the way we do it in that program is that I present 3 RCR lectures that are part of their weekly seminar series. And I think it's fair to say that that hasn't worked optimally, and we're looking for ways to improve that. I'm heartened, but also intimidated by the fact that Dr. Pincus has done such a fabulous job at Pitt. And
16 years, though.
Well, I think we have a lot to learn
overnight.
from that. On a more positive note, I'll say that recently the focus has been on providing RCR training to postdocs and clinical fellows. And a couple of years ago, I and Dr. Rick McGee, who many of you may know, at Northwestern, developed a course that's entitled Taking Responsibility for the Responsible Conduct of Research. And this is it's a formal course, although postdocs don't get credit for it. And we present, we offer this for postdocs and fellows who are trainees on these grants so that they can satisfy the requirement. And so in terms of, I just want to kind of end it by asserting some of the challenges and questions that we have. I already talked about how do we involve the trainers of the trainees. One of the ways that we've been dealing with this is that, so Dr. Pink has talked about ethics in action. One of the things that we all now do in our courses is that we require the students in the class to have an interview with their trainer, so that usually means their advisor or mentor, about 2 of the topics that we cover in our RCR class, and they have to submit a reflection on that to the class. Okay. So that's one of the ways we've been dealing with that. There's this issue of when RCR courses should be offered, early or late, how to integrate it into the curriculum, making RCR training available to all postdocs as opposed to just trainees. And also a big question that we have is how RCR training should be assessed. So I'll just leave those as questions that hopefully we can discuss in the panel.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a complicated roadmap that you put up there. And last, but certainly not least, we're going to hear from 4 of the graduate students who really are going to be the recipient of all these efforts and who have put together this amazing day for all of us. So they're going to draw on their different experiences with ethics training that they've had, and they've compiled their thoughts to present some questions. Our first presenter, are you going to do the presentation?
I'll do all the talking.
You're going to do all the talking. So we have, she's going to do all the talking. So, but we have Stephanie Neufel, who is a PhD student in biomedical engineering, Stephanie, and Krista Nelson, who's in the DPT PhD program in biomed, and Sarah Berger, who's also a PhD student in the interdepartmental neuroscience program, and Emma Belarjan, who is the DPT PhD student in biomedical engineering.
Yeah, so certainly as we thought about putting together this panel, it was of interest to have some student perspective on kind of what experiences we have had and how those have gone. And so the 4 of us really put together these ideas as a group. So just for logistics, I'll go through them. But then hopefully we can have a bit more of open discussion, not only with us, since we're just 4 cases, but also other students on experiences you've had or opportunities you wish you had. So in our experience, we've really had very different backgrounds with regards to ethics training. As David was just talking about, some of us have only taken the RCR courses or online city training for doing research. I had Dr. Pincus's required coursework in ethics concepts for engineers from previous experiences. Other of us have gone ahead and taken elective coursework, and this could be interdisciplinary across students of many departments, including law students, ethics students, etc. And then also graduate level involvement in the medical humanities and bioethics program here at Northwestern. So really kind of run the gamut of ways in which you can get involved and levels of involvement. But regardless of how different these experiences have been, there were some common threads and themes that came up in our discussions. One of those being that I think some of the reason why, particularly from students' perspectives, ethics education sometimes goes misunderstood is that the significance and the goals of ethics training or coursework are not well communicated. And I think that sometimes, it may be better understood by the people in this room, but there are also people that opted not to partake in this symposium. And making that aware to those students that may not see the importance of it, I think is certainly something that's important regardless of what kind of ethics training you're providing. And I think also, coming from an engineering perspective or scientific perspective, some of the challenges with grappling with ethical issues in training is that it really doesn't give you a concrete skill. You're not learning similar skills that you may be getting from your other engineering coursework, but it's a bit more fluid, a bit more ill-defined, and provides you with rather a new perspective or even feedback on the field that you're entering or participating in currently. And there isn't always a right answer, which really kind of bugs, especially engineers and scientists. And I think understanding why there isn't always a right answer and communicating that that's not the point of ethics training, but rather, as many of the panelists have already talked about, providing you with those tools that as you move forward, you'll have the opportunities to apply later on. So also, as we were talking about all of these different experiences we've had, I think that there really are two different camps, and this is more based on just my experiences, but I think there are different levels of ethics training, and the goals and expectations are very different. And I think sometimes it may be important on the students to communicate what they're expecting out of a course, and also at the level of faculty and departments to really understand what their goals are as far as providing this coursework. So I've listed some things based on my experiences in a full semester-long course in ethics, and then also, as David was talking about, I took the 3 seminars in my first quarter in campus with BME, and there's very different goals of both of those. And I think really deciding what your aims are and going ahead with communicating those and expectations to the students would provide the students with a better understanding of what they're expected to get out of it, and possibly eliminate some misunderstandings about why it would be important. One of my favorite quotes was from when I took Dr. Pincus's class, was the TA kind of started the class by saying, if you don't understand why this is important, please come and talk to us, because we're not getting the point across. It's not that these issues aren't important, it's that maybe we're not communicating it in a way that makes it meaningful for you in your research or in your everyday classes. So let's do that in a better way. But at the end of the day, we're graduate students here in graduate programs for fields that are not ethics. You know, we're in neuroscience, we're in physical therapy, we're in engineering. And what is the best use of our time? I think there are a lot of options out there, but it's worth considering where you want to go and what really are the most important concepts that you want to get across. Is it the ethical principles and historical concepts, or the theoretical framework that would really give a foundation for students moving forward? Is it important to discuss current or historic cases that have results to see where those went wrong or went right, or what the outcomes were? Is it identifying cases from student experiences, like the final project in Dr. Pincus's class? Is it going out into the community and seeing ethics grand rounds or clinical case studies? Or is really just the end goal to get practical experience with what the rules and regulations are, and what those expectations are as far as professional actions? So I think at the end of all of this, we, as our conversation continued, came up with more questions than answers, and that's kind of how ethics goes, I guess. But I'll pose some of those right now. Should ethics be coursework required or not? And if it's not required, will we have the initiative, but also the support to go and pursue it? And I think that support needs to come from departments and faculties to say, yeah, this is a good use of your time. And yeah, maybe, leaving the lab for an hour to go talk about an ethics journal club would be productive in your education. Should it be for credit or not? And really, if it is for credit, what do the assignments and what do the assessments really gain to our experience? Should students take it early or late? I know David talked about this. Early on, maybe it is more important just to get the rules and regulations on the table so that you know how you're expected to act, and those don't kind of come up as unknowns later on. And it also provides you with the opportunity to then apply your concepts later. But I think another very valid point is that without the experience in your field, it's really difficult to see why ethics would come up. You have to have that perspective and opportunity to look back to really be more critical and possibly see where it could come into play. Should it be taught by department or more multidisciplinary. By department, you can definitely tailor what information and cases would be relevant and have more, I guess, tailored information. Interdisciplinary, though, really does expose you to new opinions and ideas, and honestly, I think can give some very frank feedback on the work that we do that may seem so commonplace if you only talk to colleagues. How could our programs better incorporate or allow for ethics study? I mean, I think this day is a great start, but it'll be interesting to see how that's possible moving forward. And I think certainly overall, one of the common themes of today is that providing cases are really important, but it's really what cases are they, and are they relevant, and are they practical, and do students see them as being valid? So where should we go from here? I think we've posed a lot of questions, but hopefully there's more discussion, both following up the few minutes we have left today and then also moving forward. So thanks.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you. Well, we do have time for questions, comments, follow-ups from our panel or from responding. Yeah, let me.
Do you want me to walk around? I can help you too.
Rico.
Thanks. That was really interesting. Thank you, guys. I'm about to embark on teaching my first bioethics course, so I'm especially attuned to a lot of this. And I thought I'd start at the very end because the course is taught by department or interdisciplinary. And the reason I want to ask that is because I've done some sort of discussion groups and stuff in ethics, and what I found, and this is for, what I'm going to be teaching is for sophomore biomedical engineering students. And one of the things I found, to my surprise, is that their views on ethical issues seem to be really monolithic. So, you know, I get in, I present some kind of a discussion point. I mean, this is amongst small groups so far, and in freshmen. And they all seem to be totally in agreement on everything, which is sort of contrary to what I'm hoping to generate some kind of conversation about that. And I wonder if you guys could have had some sort of insight on dealing with, 18-year-olds, basically. I'll just leave it at that. Thanks.
I think just one brief comment, and then I'll turn it over, is that I think that takes time also. I'm not sure if that was just one meeting, but I think that was also a different experience for me in the 3 RCR lectures versus a full semester course. I mean, it really does, to delve into some of these issues and to have the open environment to speak and to possibly argue with someone else, that takes a little bit of a time to build that relationship within the classroom. And so possibly it's something, if you have more time, could be developed.
What was the case you were presenting? Because, I mean, it really gets interesting when you present those cases that don't have that obvious answer, and then the students, could start arguing, and maybe it'd get really intense and they'd get all angry at each other. But, there are issues out there that don't have that right answer, and those are the ones that keep me up at night and anger me.
Yeah, well, it was critical thinking. So we were talking about things from critical thinking. And I think it especially had to do with kind of complementary medicine, sort of alternative views for therapy like that. And the bioengineering students were all like, that's all bogus stuff. Let's get back down to the science and talk about that. Really, which was fine with me. That made me happy. But it didn't generate conversation and contrary viewpoints.
I think actually the fact that you were okay with their answers sort of encourages them to settle on it also. Yeah, right, microphone. I find a lot of times that what it takes is someone to push back and poke holes in what they're saying and, play them off one another. Well, he said this. What do you think about that? Or what would you respond to this critique? So I think the selection of case is really crucial because you want a case that's rich enough and has enough dimensions that you can turn it around and look at it from different angles. And they're, when they come in, if they're freshmen, they're not going to see all the angles at first if it's a rich case. And so then you can push back on something. But if it's a case where, I'm not sure quite what you were doing with the complementary medicine idea, but if it's a case where it seems like there's more or less a common sense answer, and there's a consensus that they reach pretty quick, And if the instructor's okay with that consensus, well then yeah, it's just gonna sit there.
How many students are in your class?
That class there were 19, but the next one is 145.
Oh,
My response was not about 145. Yikes. But I think the other thing, too, is sometimes you can do like longitudinal description of the cases. So you can present half the case if there's something that's happened over time, have them discuss, and then bring out the richness, and then give them the second half of the information, or the third, break it into pieces. And sometimes that gets at what seems like simple becomes more complicated as more things are filled in. So that's sometimes an effective way to do it.
You could also, I mean, I'm only speaking from my experience in like a multidisciplinary environment in the MHB program, but because we had neuroscience students, med students, genetic engineering students, ethicists, you really do get a broader input, I guess, and everybody can kind of speak from their own expertise. But if you are just dealing with, second year biomedical engineering students, maybe you could find out what some of their other interests, or, maybe minors or what else they have, so they can bring something else to the table, and it might create a little bit more of a debate.
Yeah, just one quick comment. What I usually do with case studies is to have the students talk about the case first in groups, so they just sort of turn and talk to their nearest neighbors, and there's a greater likelihood that even if there's consensus in the group, that there'll be some variability from one group to the other, and so then when you reconvene, it may be the case that one group had talked about something different than another group, and that sometimes helps.
Yeah, well, one more thing too. When you gave them the case, did you give it to them ahead of time? Was it a day before thing? Was there assigned reading?
It was not. So that's one thing I noticed in the earlier list. Give them some time to think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I rarely talk about a case that they haven't read about first. There's a couple times when I do that. But when I do it, it's got to be really structured, and I have slides, and we step through it. And I do what you do, let them develop a response, and then sort of spring on them what really happened.
This is a little change in subject. My interest in ethics for the last decade has been financial conflict of interest, mainly in the clinical area, but the same principle applies. And I was very interested in the first talk this morning by Dr. Elliott in that regard. And in looking at the big chart on emotions up there before, I can't remember the author, Plushki or something? Plachek. I was looking for denial. I don't know if denial is considered an emotion, but I consider denial the biggest obstacle to getting people to ethically reflect. And I just like to give two examples. One, in my own field, in physical therapy, we have this huge issue of financial conflict of interest in referrals. So somebody's getting a financial interest for referring a patient, and we're opposed to that. And colleagues get entangled in these relationships, and they're in denial of the fact that it is an ethical issue, because they say, well, it's legal. So if it's legal, it's okay. And so they fall back on the legality, and then all of the ethical nuance just is tossed out. And it was very interesting when I saw Goldman Sachs up before Congress, and the chairman of Goldman Sachs was being quizzed by congressmen after the financial collapse, and he gave exactly the same answer that colleagues in my field give when presented with financial conflict of interest, because they kept pushing him. You knew the risk in these very complicated financial instruments that you were peddling, and you knew that people didn't really understand the risk in there, but you kept peddling them. Why? And he kept pushing the guy. And the chairman of Goldman Sachs finally, up against the wall, and he was very clever dancing around the issue, of course, he finally said, these practices are going on throughout our field, and if we didn't engage in them, our corporation would not be able to survive. And that was exactly what people say clinically is, well, my practice won't be able to survive unless I engage in this behavior. And so that becomes the business success becomes the preeminent ethical value. And the conflict of interest just falls by the wayside. So I guess I'd like some discussion on denial.
Yes, I am.
At the end of the day, I think when you're thinking about emotions, denial is just a much more complicated, and we have a psychiatrist in the room too who can maybe talk about denial in a different way, but your point is well taken. I think a lot of times we really frame information in a way that makes us feel comfortable with our own actions, whether you want to call it denial or whether you want to call it rationalization or whether you want to call it a number of other things. And we often surround ourselves by like-minded people who make us either share our same values or are very comfortable with the way we approach some of these things that may seem very different. I mean, the best example for me is in the work that I've done either in India or in France or in other parts of the world, and even the different conceptions about health and illness and different conceptions about who gets to make decisions. When you're surrounded in communities, and that's why I think the interdisciplinary dialogue or talking across disciplines and across fields is so critical, you get into a kind of mindset. So I don't know whether denial is the word that I would use, but I do feel that there is a very kind of self-protective and a very strong instinct for us to. We spend a lot of time in our professions. We have to believe what we're doing is doing good in some way, and sometimes that comes with another set of problems.
Just to relate this back to education, it could be a very similar sort of concept if you're walking into a room of students who it may not be denial because they actually may not be in ethical situations at this point, but unaware. And I think denial versus unawareness, they're both areas in which you basically have to shed light on what could be out there, or just kind of educate, and that's probably a first step.
Yeah, I'm gonna.
Yeah, right to this one. I guess I have a little bit of a luxury because most of the time when I'm teaching students, it's not the case that we're talking about things that they personally do. And that's a much tougher spot to be in. I'll say two things, though. One is that I do try to stress a lot the distinction between ethics and law, and that following the law is in no way a substitute or the same thing as being ethical, and vice versa. And I found that, I guess I've been surprised sometimes by how elusive that concept is at first to some students, because they do equate, some of them, following the law with being ethical. And it helps to trace back, to use history, to show how certain actions that are against the law now weren't against the law 50 years ago. So were they unethical then, or were they ethical then and they're not ethical now? Same action. So that helps. The other thing I'd say is that what I also do is try to dig into a case and explore all the stakeholders and what they did and the justifications that they offered for their actions, especially if it's like a scandal case and they're reading newspaper articles from contemporary sources. Then hopefully maybe they can see how some of those defenses fall flat, and a lot of them are, I agree, rooted in denial or just sort of reactionary self-justification for what they want to see done, for what's in their interest.
We have a comment from Dr. Applebaum.
Yeah, I have had exactly your experience with conflict of interest related issues, and I have conceptualized it as denial as well, and struggled for a long time with how to get around that. What I came up with, is sort of my solution here, which is not dissimilar to what we see in clinical settings when we have patients who deny their disorders, is that a head-on assault isn't going to work. Because self-interest is related to it in one way or another. Even in the clinical setting, the self-interest is someone who can't acknowledge that they have serious coronary artery disease, for example, is not going to be overcome by insisting that they really do and showing them the angiograms and trying to confront it head on. I have come to believe that reframing, if you really want to change people's views and their behaviors, you've got to reframe it as something other than an ethical issue, because thinking of themselves as having behaved unethically is simply intolerable for most people. And you heard me do a little bit of that with the therapeutic misconception issue at the end of my talk, where I suggested that if you didn't want to see this as essential to meaningful consent, then at the very least, maybe you don't want to get sued by patients who, didn't get it and find out after the fact and feel as though they've been abused. Similarly, with conflict of interest, I have come to reframe it. If you're interested, I can share a paper with you that I wrote that views it this way. As a policy question and not an ethical question, as a specific example of a more general principal-agent dilemma that we run into throughout society, where the question is, when somebody has more than one principal for whom they are acting as the agent, how can either of those principals or any of those principals ensure that the person's really acting for them? So if I'm a psychiatrist who's taking money from a pharmaceutical company and you're my patient, how do you know I'm making decisions in your interest rather than in the pharmaceutical company's interest? If you tell me I'm a bad person for taking the money, I'm going to have all kinds of justifications for why that's not true. On the other hand, if you tell me that this is a policy dilemma that just has to be resolved the way we resolve similar dilemmas elsewhere in society, maybe I'm more open to hearing that and seeing myself as more like everyone else, and therefore having to come up with a solution for that context.
I think we have time for one really short question, and you had your hand up.
I'd like to pick on Emma and the other students briefly. So specifically your comment on not learning any concrete skills in ethics, which I'm guessing Dr. Pincus would agree with me here. I would say there certainly are concrete skills you can learn in studying ethics, like how to look at problems, frame them in different ways, identify key pieces of information, also what sort of information you are lacking, and things like that. And the reason I bring this up is not just to criticize, but more to say it sort of highlights what I think is a problem in young engineers and scientists and the way they perceive ethics. And from my personal experience, because I took the undergraduate bioethics course at Pitt when I did my bachelor's there. And from my peers and myself going in thinking, I don't need to be taught how to be moral, because that's what ethics is if you don't know anything about the field of ethics. So it sort of highlights, I'm not going to learn any concrete skills here. Like, why would I study this? What's the use of this? And you don't have the experience to see how it applies. And you don't, so you just, I guess to just highlight that perspective for me, it's like, oh, there's nothing to study here. So if in teaching ethics, could you possibly take the approach of, rather than try to teach ethics or sell it as we're teaching you ethics, say, sell it as we are teaching you how to think about these problems. We are teaching you how to do this type of analysis. And then on the higher levels, once you have a reason to learn ethics, then you start teaching ethics in a more traditional sense. So that's half question, half comment. Maybe you guys can go at it.
Yeah, I think I would say that, first off, I agree. I think that, if you come into the course thinking that you're not going to get anything out of it, then that's a problem. If you also come into the course thinking that you're going to get a recipe A, B, C, D, final answer, that's also going to be a problem, because either way you're really not going to get what you're expecting. And so I think kind of you hit upon it exactly, is that it's more of communicating what is the point of this and what can you expect to get out of this, and providing maybe skills or tools or approaches to moving forward is really, I think, what is probably most likely to be provided in ethics training. It's not a recipe, but it's not these theoretical concepts. It's somewhere in between.
There you go. I agree with you, and I think part of the problem is that I've actually never had the RCR training. The only ethics training I've had is the city course, and I'm a physical therapist, so I had to go through the competencies at RIC, but it was more of a complete this, do this test, pass this test, get an 80%, and you can go on to what you actually want to do, be a therapist or conduct human subject research. So I think, yeah, if you frame it more in this is a set of tools to help you solve a problem or to approach things differently, then maybe it might be a little bit more interesting, and people might start, students may not think of it as, oh, I have to take this ethics course. It's required, and maybe it's something that they actually want to learn more about.
Yeah, one thing that I have started doing in the first day of class, I have a small questionnaire, and I ask students to introduce themselves. If they've ever had an ethical dilemma, what was it? If they want to share it with us, what do they expect to get out of this class instead of an A, And they stand up in front of the class. And if there's 28 students, then that's the whole class. And I think we did that and I take notes of what students want and try to adjust accordingly if I can. So again, putting it back on the students and learning from them is really a helpful thing for a teacher.
I also, just kind of adding to it, I also think it's more than just a tool, it's like a mindset. It's another way of looking at your own research. It's almost as if, people have glasses and you can see something one way and then take and put on like sunglasses and you see it another way. So it's more than just a tool, it's a way of thinking, I would say.
Yeah. This has been an excellent question and answer period, and now we want to give Dr. DeWalt time to thank him for supporting this effort. I want to just give you all a round of applause.
So I wanted to make a few closing remarks. I have to say I was really impressed today by not only getting a lot of new information, and for me at least in the area of bioethics from the experts, but also seeing the involvement of students and having them really give it their unique perspective. I think Emma, you did a phenomenal job at the end. I congratulate you pulling a lot of things together. Many of it ad lib, going at the moment, and really pulling things together. I think if it weren't for you, I think this day would not have happened. So I wanted to thank you in particular. Thank you very much. Also, this whole event has been recorded, so we have something that we can work with, and I think that's important as well. Where do we go from now? And that was actually, where should we go from now, is the ending of your presentation before, and that's a legit question. I think we spent this time, we got a lot of new perspectives, and where do we go with this? How do we incorporate this in our courses? How can we change this? Not only at Northwestern, but the hope is that this will actually go to other institutes as well. So we've had a few delegates from other universities that attended, and the request that this would be recorded so they could actually learn from our efforts today. So again, I'd like to thank you all, and I'd like to invite you for some more discussions over maybe some beer and wine and other such great experiences, more from a social perspective, and really meet with us in the Methods Atrium to really kind of finish this great symposium day. Thank you all for your participation, also the public for all your questions and your enthusiasm. Thanks.